All right, folks, joining us on this edition of Big Ten Country as we continue previewing the Big Ten Football Conference is a good friend of the show and somebody that we apparently share a lot in common with. He is John Steppe. He is the Iowa Hawkeyes football beat reporter for the Cedar Rapids Gazette. Also hosts the Hawk Off the Press. I almost screwed that up. Hawk Off the Press podcast. John, thank you so much for joining us. And we were just having a few bonding moments before we started recording about the fact that we both had to watch a really good defense last season and a really putrid offense, you with Iowa, Ken and I with the Chicago Bears. So now that we've had that collective bonding experience, I think we have to ask you the question that's realistically on the minds of every Iowa fan. Who's going to replace Tory Taylor now that he's punting balls for the Chicago Bears?
Well, first of all, thanks again for having me on. Always a pleasure. To get to your question, they have another Australian punter, also from Melbourne.
Yes.
Also trained by the Pro Kick Australia coaches. So Reese Dakin is the next guy who kind of has to take over the mantle for Tory Taylor. Maybe not necessarily Tory Taylor 2.0 right away. I think he's naturally going to be compared a lot to Tory Taylor. I think they're even wearing the same number this year, which might be a little more pressure than I would put on myself as a freshman. But somebody who has a lot of potential. Clearly, the Pro Kick coaches could see how good of a fit Iowa was for a top-tier punter like Tory Taylor, and that probably didn't hurt in their process in terms of getting another Pro Kick punter from Australia. So that now we have that question. Yes, Iowa has another Australian punter that has gotten very good reviews. So now we can talk offense, defense, all that fun stuff.
We almost, but this is a lead in the defense. It's still special teams, but it's also this affects the defense. Since we're talking about players that made it into the pros last season from Iowa, we'd be remiss if we don't mention Cooper DeJean now making it to the pros. One, your expectation of he'll be best used within the NFL, but also just as far as the defensive backfield now, who's going to play alongside Jamiri Harris? And I know you have John Nestor coming up, but also who's going to fill that hybrid role that Cooper DeJean could play?
Yeah, first of all, with Cooper DeJean's NFL fit, I think you can really put him pretty much anywhere in the back or in the secondary. I look at it, I think some NFL teams seem to think of him more as a safety. Some thought he could play corner. I think of him kind of as the all of the above option on a quiz, where he really has the skill set to play anywhere. He played a lot of corner at Iowa. He had experience at that kind of hybrid cash safety as well. He had practiced at safety. So he's really played everywhere, and he just has this natural versatility to him. He came from a really small high school where he practically played almost every position under the sun, it felt like. So he kind of had this upbringing where he could kind of play anything. And you saw it at Iowa too, where, he could, where everyone was kind of going in expecting him to be safety or cash going into that 2022 season. And then he fits right in at corner. And that really was a good fit for him in the last 2 years. So I think if the Eagles want to put him at corner, I think he can do it. If they think safety is a better fit, I think he can do that as well. So I think and also with kind of the sub-package nature of the NFL, I think his skill set really fits that ability to just play anywhere. In terms of this year's Iowa secondary, John Nestor is the first guy that comes to mind. On the other side, Jamari Harris. He was the first teamer on the preseason depth chart. Of course, Kirk Ferentz will be the first one to say preseason depth chart. Don't take too many grand conclusions from it. He put that out before fall camp even began. So John Nestor from Chicago, it has really shown a lot of promise. Somebody that played a lot as a true freshman, which you don't necessarily see a lot. It's a lot of special teams, but still the fact that they didn't want to save him and just play him 4 games, they kept on playing him throughout the season. That says something right there. But they have some other options there. So he's one option. Deshaun Lee, he filled in when Cooper DeJean got hurt. He'd be another option. He also filled in at the beginning of the year when Jamari Harris had his sports wagering suspension. So Deshaun Lee has experience in games kind of when the bullets have been flying, he's been in there. TJ Hall would be another strong candidate there. But it's be a younger secondary at those two, or at the, not the cornerback spot that Jamari Harris is at, but at that other cornerback spot. It'll be a young group. Whoever is the one who gets the bulk of those reps, it's going to be a younger guy than they've had recently. So that'll be a little bit of a transition. And then in terms of safety, you're as experienced as you can get with Quinn Schulte, a 6th-year guy, Sebastian Castro also taking his COVID year. And then you also have Xavier Wampa, the former 5-star recruit there. So that's a pretty good trio of safeties there. And when Iowa's in the cash and able to play all 3 of those guys, that's a nice thing for whoever comes in at cornerback, whether it's Ness or somebody else. Is you look at those other positions in the secondary, and they are very veteran, kind of everywhere except for that one young spot.
This was an Iowa team last year that had a really great run of being a great scoring defense. They did not allow very many points, like basically the Penn State game accepted. They just really were able to clamp down in a lot of ways, but surprisingly, were not particularly adept at forcing turnovers. Is that maybe something that the team is going to be kind of a little bit more adamant about this season, just to give that offense a few more opportunities here and there to get the ball in kind of advantageous positions?
Yeah, it's interesting because that has been a strength for Iowa historically. It was not last year, as you said, but that has been something that Iowa's defense has been very good at, is either 2021 or 2022 is, I think, the 25 interception in one season year. So you look at it and they have a track record there. You know, Phil Parker is not a super aggressive defensive coordinator, and I don't see them modifying their approach to get those turnovers. But I do think those turnover numbers probably will go up this year when you look at, you have the experienced secondary, you have probably one of the best linebacker cores in the country, if not the best. So you look at it, and usually I think last year is a little bit of an anomaly with those turnover numbers, and you have plenty of experience coming back. So it's hard to predict turnovers. There is a certain unpredictability of it versus a lot of other stats. But if I had to guess, we'll probably see a little bit closer to what we're used to seeing from these Iowa defenses in the turnover categories.
Getting back to that linebacking core, your thoughts last year, Noah Shannon was wrapped in sports betting. Jay Higgins jumped out and ascended. What were your thoughts, one, of how he played last year, but what are the expectations on defense for him this year, being perhaps the lead linebacker of that core?
Yeah, it's interesting with Jay Higgins because the first few years of his Iowa career, he kind of really went under the radar. He was behind Jack Campbell, who was kind of like a magnet to the ball, it seemed like, at all times. And you saw why, too, you saw that other teams, NFL teams, noticed that as well, with the Lions picking him as high as they did.
We know, John, we know.
Yeah, we do.
I need to remember where I'm talking here. Yeah, in NFC North country. Yeah, people are familiar with Jack Campbell. And yeah, you saw what Jack Campbell can do. He was a menace at Iowa, and there really wasn't opportunities behind him because Jack Campbell just never left the field. You'd see sometimes in these midweek interview availabilities, it'd be like a gash on his leg, all that. And it seemed like it was no big deal for Jack Campbell because he's just that tough of a guy where, okay, yeah, no, that's just Jack Campbell for you. So going back to Higgins, though, so he kind of flew under the radar last year. He steps up, gets the nod at Big Ten Media Days after Noah Shannon kind of stepped away with the sports gambling thing. Noah Shannon, now undrafted free agent with the Raiders. Pretty good chance, I think, to make that team on the defensive line. But with Higgins, he really, you could tell, was learning along the way from Jack Campbell. And he will be the first one to say about how much he learned from Jack Campbell. And then put up this year that I don't think anybody in their right mind was expecting, where it was, I think, 171 total tackles, which tied a program record for tackles in a single season. And it was a group, he's a key leadership role in a group that once again led the country in yards allowed per play, which to see that happen in back-to-back seasons is really remarkable. And probably the most remarkable thing, You even just go back to the year before, 2022. And that was the first time he's getting really substantial defensive snaps. And that was because of an injury to Justin Jacobs at that Leo spot. So he really didn't have much game opportunities, but just immediately burst onto the scene. And watching him, you would think this was a guy who was a third-year starter for Iowa, but he was first year as a full starter. And it kind of makes you wonder, okay, what can he do with a full offseason after being thrust into that starting role? And Phil Steele had him as his Big Ten preseason defensive player of the year. He was second in the Cleveland.com poll. So he's no longer under the radar like how he once was.
Ken, do you have any more defensive questions, or can we get to the kind of sizable elephant in the room with this team?
Thank you, James. Just one. You mentioned the cast position in Sebastian Castro, and I just had a thought because we've seen it with Cooper DeJean, we've seen it with Cade McNamara, with Deacon Hill having to play. If Sebastian Castro, and you mentioned he's taking his 6th year for COVID, if he gets nicked up, have they already kind of started playing a player to fill the cast position when they're in that formation?
John Nestor would be another option at cash. He would be an interesting guy. In terms of safety in general, Cohen Entringer is somebody that we heard a lot of really high reviews from. The play that I think most people who don't watch a ton of Iowa might remember from Cohen Entringer was Big Ten championship game. There's that punt coverage that Iowa had where there's the guy who kind of blew the tackle on maybe the 9 or the 7 yard line, or way back, blows the tackle there, and then goes all the way down the field and prevents a touchdown as the Michigan punt returner was looking like he was going to take it to the house. And that really, okay, you'd rather have Cohen Entringer make that tackle, the first time, but that hustle really, that was not the first impressive play that he made. That really has caught people's attention. So he could be a guy. Zach Lutmer is another guy that could potentially step in if injuries happen. So you're kind of curious to see. We've been kind of waiting for Cohen Entringer, if they didn't return so many guys, Castro taking the COVID year, Quinn Schulte taking the COVID year. I think Cohen would probably be a starter right now. So that would be a name in particular to keep an eye on at kind of those safety positions, and they'll shuffle guys around. Like they could move Nestor from corner to cash. You'll see maybe a little bit of that if injuries do happen. But yeah, they're in a position, particularly at safety, where I'm kind of intrigued to see. We're going to get this coming Saturday, we're going to get to see practice. They'll be their annual Kids Day practice. And one of the things I'm curious about is seeing some of these second team safeties, because we've heard good things about them, but we haven't really seen them in action so much outside of special teams and things like that.
All right, we've tossed enough flowers in the direction of Iowa's defense. We've had enough, positive vibes, I suppose. It's time to go to the other side of the coin. But I guess, it might be a little bit more positive this season. The Brian Ferentz era, rather, is officially over. We'll let Iowa fans react how they will to that statement. But I think that now that he's exited stage left, I do just kind of have to ask overall, what is the feeling around this offense now that it's being led by Tim Lester? Is there an optimism that they're finally going to be able to produce a little bit more offense? Like, what's kind of the goal that they're working towards, aside from scoring more than, 20 offensive touchdowns in 14 games? What's kind of like the overall guiding principle here now that we've moved forward from that particular part of the Ferentz regime?
Yeah, there's definitely an optimism. It feels like almost a renewed energy with Tim Lester's offense within the football building. I think among a lot of Iowa fans, there's some cautious optimism. They've heard this, things are going to be different this year, ordeal. They've heard this a few times before, only for things to not be different. But there definitely is some energy. They haven't shown us too much in terms of what's in store with this scheme, but clearly a lot of motion. It's a Shanahan style West Coast offense that they're going to be running. We saw motion almost constantly during 11-on-11 work in the spring during our one full practice that we got to see. So pre-snap motion, during snap motion, saw a lot of both of those. but there is an energy around it, and there is reason for optimism. If you're a half glass full person, there are reasons for your glass to be half full this year. You have as experienced of an offensive line as they've had in recent history. You've got obviously an injury-prone quarterback, but probably as good of a backup plan at quarterback as Big Ten schools outside of the Ohio States, the Oregons, the Michigans of the world have. Running back, they somehow retained everybody despite having seemingly more guys than there were opportunities for. Tight end, okay, that's me solid again. You lose Eric Hall to the NFL, and it still looks like it could be a fantastic year for Iowa tight ends. So there's a lot of reason to be optimistic if you are a half glass full person. Of course, the flip side is, okay, there are reasons for optimism in past years too. And oftentimes that optimism didn't really turn into results. Quite obviously, in a few of those games, we were talking 10-7, 13-10. Yeah, we've heard this before in terms of, things are going to be different this year. So the question is, will it actually be different? But there are reasons, if you are an optimistic person, to kind of quote unquote believe in this Iowa offense.
John, even though you came at me with the Packers prior to the interview, I want to share sympathy again with you as we talked about having defenses and struggling offenses as a Bears fan. You got Caleb Brown whenever he comes off suspension. You got Jared Bowie having potential. You mentioned motion. To Bears, Musa Muhammad once said that, Chicago is a place where wide receivers go to die. What is Lester going to do? And you mentioned the motion to help perhaps attract more wide receivers, but just to use the wide receivers that are already in the building. And I know you mentioned motion, but can you speak more to what we can expect to get from the outside? Because we already know it's tight end you basically when you're talking about Iowa.
Yeah, that's a great question, because that's a huge part of whether this offense does better. Where when people ask me what the number one question mark I consider on this team to be, it's wide receiver. It's not quarterback. It's not offensive line. It's wide receiver. And I just had the wide receivers coach, John Budmeyer, longtime guy at Wisconsin, who's been on the Iowa staff and has kind of worked his way up the Iowa staff. First of all, an analyst, now wide receivers coach. And he talked about bringing accountability into the room. And that's one thing that he's thinking of as a coach. But in terms of kind of schematically what people might see, there were a lot of times where we saw like Cade McNamara in the spring. A walk-on from Williamsburg, Iowa, transferred from a community college with really elite speed where, okay, you can put him on pre-snap motion and it gives that defense a different look. I see motion really is the way that maybe these wide receivers can get more involved. Because you look at the last few years, there were times where you would say the best playmakers at that position were not being put in positions to make plays. Where you look at Charlie Jones back in 2021 and, okay, you would not recognize him as an NFL caliber wide receiver from just watching how Iowa's offense utilized him. Keegan Johnson, who has since transferred to Kansas State, another person where you're kind of wondering, okay, are they best utilizing his skill set? Arlen Bruce, a guy who transferred to Oklahoma State before getting wrapped up in the sports gambling scandal. He's the guy that you'd say, okay, he had kind of a little bit of a Deebo Samuel nature to him, but they weren't necessarily probably using him as best as they could. So I think this motion potentially gives them a way of kind of giving the wide receivers different looks. And it'll be a challenging thing. I think getting this position to get more production, it gets to be a more difficult question with each year because they haven't been able to retain guys. And when you have as much attrition as they've had, you could look at some of the wide receivers who've transferred elsewhere, who've had success, and you say, oh man, this would be a lot easier to bolster production if you still had these guys. And, I mentioned Cade McNamara. Okay, there's a walk on there. And that's kind of a little bit of where we're talking is, okay, Caleb Brown really had a great second half of the year, but, off the field issues this year, 1-game suspension for an OWI charge. So, okay, you can't totally rely on him 100%. Obviously, the first game, you're only so concerned, with that schedule that they start off with. But Seth Anderson is a guy who transferred in, really didn't accomplish much. You need to get more production out of him. You're going to need some younger guys like Jarriett Bowie and Dayton Howard to step up. And the other thing, too, that we've heard a couple times from coaches, Abdul Hajj, tight ends coach, said it on my podcast. Kirk Ferentz said something similarly at Big Ten Media Days, that execution only goes that schematics only goes so far. And you can have all these motions and everything to give different looks to the wide receivers, which I think will help. But at the end of the day, you have these guys that need to execute, and you're doing it with kind of the leftovers of what's left after really facing a lot of transfer portal attrition there, more than probably any other position for Iowa. Quarterback also has faced a lot of attrition, but the difference there is they've brought in a lot of really good guys too. And the additions have not necessarily matched the departures at that wide receiver position. So that is the biggest area of uncertainty here for this Iowa offense, in my opinion.
I mean, since Ken mentioned it, I feel like I kind of have to go in this direction now, where you're talking about the tight ends the school's been able to produce. And you have Luke Lachey, who ended up suffering a season-ending injury last season. You really thought you were going to have this really incredible two-headed monster at tight end. You didn't end up getting that. He is back. However, what are your expectations for Luke heading into this season?
I'm really curious because Luke has had a lot of potential. We've kind of seen him as a guy that could really have that breakout year. It looked like it was going to be last year. You look at those first two games, what he did, week 1, week 2, say, man, these are some really good numbers here. And then early on in that week 3 game against Western Michigan, you see the injury there. And that kind of was the big what if. But I think he is a guy who could play himself into first or second round consideration in the NFL draft. Physically, he just looks like that kind of tight end. We've seen flashes of it, but last year, as we've mentioned, that with the injury, before that being behind Sam Laporta, haven't really gotten that full sense of what he can do. He obviously has some good football pedigree, being the son of Jim Lachey. So he has that going for him too. Not that that's the only thing by any means, but I think he's a guy that really could have a breakout year and really has the benefit too of having Addison Ostrenga behind him. He's a guy that was kind of thrust into the spotlight when Lachey got hurt, when Eric Hall got hurt. All of a sudden that tight end room got pretty thin, and Ostrenga really stepped up and was a key part of the little bit of Iowa offense that we did see in the second half of the year. He was making a lot of really good plays. There was one from one of the home games last year where I was like, man, did he really catch that? So when you have somebody like Addison Ostrenga in that tight end 2 spot, that really, I think, can give Luke Lachey more potential in terms of defenses can't focus too much attention on him without really being kept honest on the other side there. So if Iowa is going to get to where they want to go, I would expect to see a heavy dose of tight end usage, both with Luke Lachey and Addison Ostrenga, and maybe even a third or fourth guy, as we've seen in past years as well.
2 questions. The first one is just a yes or no. How often have you seen yet or expect the tight ends also to be involved in motion? And I don't want to dwell on that one too long, but also, you have a really good center in Logan Jones. You talked about the trenches. Well, you have formidable trenches, but you talk about the offensive line. What are other offensive linemen should we look at? Because, again, I do a professional show, and we're always looking for offensive linemen. So what are some of the key offensive linemen going along with Logan Jones that perhaps people should be watching this season coming up?
First of all, I would expect to see tight end motion, yes. And then offensive line, Logan Jones, as you mentioned, the really impressive thing with him, too, is he started out as a defensive lineman, kind of like Tyler Linderbaum. And that first year, he was really thrown into the fire, but was able to, stay afloat. And, now you're looking at a guy who's a third-year starter going into this year. In terms of other offensive linemen, this is a really experienced group. And you're returning, I think it's 6 different guys with at least 10 career starts. So you look at it, if Iowa's offensive line does not compete at the level that people kind of expect reputationally from Iowa, you kind of say, okay, what is it going to take? If it doesn't take this much experience that they have this year, a couple guys in particular that stand out, Jennings Dunker, he started 13 games last year. He's a guy, he's been, I believe, the back-to-back Solon Beef Days hay bale toss champion. He did not participate this year in the hay bale toss, but the previous 2 years he won the hay bale toss. He's a really strong guy. He's kind of slimmed down a little bit to probably a more practical weight than where he was at one point last year. So he's a guy that really, I think, could break or kind of really take another step with kind of another year, another full season as a starter. Mason Richmond on the other side at left tackle, 4th-year starter. Connor Colby, a 4th-year starter. That experience is something special there. The kind of interesting Swiss Army knife, I guess you'd say, of the offensive line is Nick DeYoung. He's a guy that on the preseason depth chart is not a first-teamer. But again, preseason depth chart, especially on offensive line, can vary a lot. But they've played him at pretty much every position in games except for center. He's been left guard, left tackle, right tackle. So if there's an injury, you could see him plug in, experienced guy using his COVID year, former walk-on. So he's another guy. So it's an interesting year for this offensive line when you're talking about as much experience as you have, where Logan Jones, 3rd-year starter, Colby and Richmond, 4th-year starters, Jennings Dunker, 2nd year fully as a starter, but an older guy as well. This could be if the offensive line, kind of as I was saying before, if it doesn't click this year, I don't know what it would take for that to happen, just because they have that much experience. And the other thing too that I think kind of held them back in past years was a little bit of the schematics, where it seemed like everybody in the free world knew that Iowa was going to run the ball sometimes this past year.
Yeah.
Like, I was at the NFL Combine back in March, and Tyler Nubin, I was asking him about kind of his impressions of the Iowa offense, and he had something along the lines of, yeah, we knew what was coming in the second half. So when everybody knows what's going to happen, you can have the best offensive line in the world, but math is math. And,
Right.
you know, if you have the entire defense expecting it to be running a run, those 5 offensive linemen can only do so much. So that's where schematics could help the offensive line probably more than we realized. But at the same time, the offensive line has not been at that level. So I'm hesitant to give them too much praise, just because these last couple of years, they haven't been at that level that I think a lot of fans expect to see from them. And you kind of need to see it before I totally believe it.
I think we've gone long enough in this podcast talking about vegetable issues. I think it's time we get into the sugary cereal, and I can ask you about Cade McNamara. What are your expectations, I should say, for Cade McNamara going into this season? What do you think Iowa fans can expect out of the quarterback position in 2024?
Yeah, that's a great question. Really, I enjoy the sugary cereal. Fun fact in Cedar Rapids, if the wind is going in the right direction, you can smell the Crunchberry cereal being made because there's a Quaker Oats plant. So the Crunchberry question. Yes. So the Crunchberry question of quarterback, I think with Cade, it depends a lot on how healthy he can be. Right now, he says he's 100% healthy. He's the QB1 going into fall camp. There's not really any question about that. Of course, Kirk has there's competition everywhere, but it's clear that Cade is the clear incumbent there at that QB1 spot. In terms of what he can do, I would expect better than what we saw last year. I don't think we really saw the true Cade when he had that preseason quad injury that he suffered in front of, is the one practice that Iowa has open to fans and media in fall camp. And that was the one where he suffered that injury. So we saw that quad injury, and I don't think he ever truly was 100% from that. And I think when you look at those numbers from last year, I kind of put a pretty big asterisk on that just because of that. Can he be back to that 2021 level that he was with Michigan? That's certainly what Iowa fans are hoping for. If they do get that level from him, you have a reasonable path to CFP berth there. I would expect probably somewhere in between would be kind of my realistic, kind of putting the realistic hat on, where that wide receiver position at Michigan was a lot better than this Iowa wide receiver position. Of course, the tight end position is, pretty darn good at Iowa, but he also wasn't like he didn't have tight end options at Michigan either when he had Eric Hall there. So I think reasonable to expect better than last year, but is he going to be a carbon copy of what we saw in 2021? Not necessarily. The nice thing for Iowa fans is they have kind of a little bit of an insurance policy with Brendan Sullivan transferring from Northwestern. And I can't look back at my time on the beat and think of a time when the backup quarterback situation was as good as it's been, or at least appears to be going into fall camp, where you have a backup option. If things don't work for Cade, you have another guy who started Big Ten games.
Sure do.
And has put up decent numbers. I'd probably say decent, but only decent numbers in the Big Ten as a starting quarterback. That's a nice luxury to have if things don't work out with Cade. But he seems very much geared toward getting back on the field, winning, really competitive guy. And I think he's anxious to prove a lot because there have been a lot of questions about him going back to his time at Michigan. And I think there's going to be some motivation there to show that he can be the quarterback that he believes he can be and not just a game manager. That's probably a considered profanity if you're within 100 feet of Cade McNamara.
John, thank you for the time. My last question. You mentioned the chance for CFP. What are your expectations record-wise? But with the divisions being eliminated within the Big Ten, there was kind of a benefit for Iowa, where it was almost like a fair lane to the Big Ten championship game. And that's no longer there. But there are going to be chances that 3 Big Ten teams may be able to make it into the playoffs. So with all those questions, what are your expectations of this upcoming season?
Yeah, I've been going back and forth on record between 10-2 and 9-3. You look at their schedule, and despite not having divisions and not having the benefit of the Big Ten West, they still seem to have somehow won the scheduling lottery. They play Ohio State, but they avoid Oregon, they avoid Penn State, they avoid Michigan, they avoid USC.
Yep.
Right.
So I would say they have a good shot of being favored in 11 out of 12 games this year.
Yep.
The reality at Iowa, the one exception obviously being at Ohio State.
Yeah.
I don't think anybody's expecting them to be coming out victorious at the Horseshoe. But the reality, kind of especially in recent history at Iowa, is there's been those games where Iowa kind of wishes they had one back. Where you look last year, the Minnesota game. Obviously, the whole fear catch debacle is what a lot of fans remember from that. But
we were mad.
So mad.
But that offense was not playing winning football to put themselves in a position where just a decent offensive showing should have put them in easy win territory against that Minnesota team with how bad that Minnesota team was in 2023. So Minnesota was kind of the one that I think a lot of fans wish they could have had back. You go back to 2022 and Illinois was kind of one of those games where it's like, okay, you wish you could have had that one back. You'd say the same about Nebraska that year. So Iowa kind of has a tendency, and even going back to 2021, you could say Wisconsin, when Wisconsin was not at its best, and Purdue, were the 2 games that really I think a lot of Iowa fans wish they could have had back. So you kind of wonder who's going to be that team that Iowa should beat that they get tripped up on. But the ceiling is high with most likely being favored in 11 games. You could even make an argument, which is kind of crazy to say with the strength of this Big Ten overall, But you can make the argument that Iowa State in week 2, non-conference, might be their second hardest game of the year because of the returning experience that Iowa State has. So, and that's a team that, did not have a phenomenal year last year. Mm-hmm. But that's just how favorable this schedule has turned out for Iowa. So I'm not ruling out an 11-1, but seeing what I've seen the last few years where there's been those games that have kind of tripped them up, that's where kind of 10-2, 9-3 territory is kind of where I land. Will it be a Nebraska again that trips them up? Certainly a team there that's returning a lot of experience. Is it UCLA, knowing that Kirk Ferentz does not have the greatest record playing out west? Is it somebody else? Time will tell on that, but I think a 10-win season is very doable. And I think you could see this Iowa team, depending on if they get caught up, you could very easily see them in that conversation, at least going into November, about could this potentially be a CFP team. I don't really see the path to Indianapolis unless they go 11-1, but you look at it and okay, could you be that third team or that fourth team? That's possible. But at the same time, those 12 spots, even though it feels big compared to what we're used to with the 4-team playoff, those spots are going to go faster. And I think a lot of people realize as well.
And they're going to definitely take things like strength of schedule into consideration, where your hardest game, like you mentioned, was the Ohio State game. And then you probably have an argument whether it's Washington or Iowa State that would be your second hardest. And that's not, especially with some of the schedules we're seeing for teams like Oregon this season and others, there are going to be, heck, the SEC now with Texas and Oklahoma, there's going to be a lot of additional strength of schedule components going on in that conference as well. So Iowa's got a really great opportunity, but they also have some pretty significant challenges getting into the playoff. John Steppe, you are always one of our favorite guests. We love just kind of, chewing the fat with you and saying silly things and also talking some really great X's and O football. You can catch all of his coverage in the Cedar Rapids Gazette and on the Hawk Off the Press podcast. John, thank you so much for joining us on Big Ten Country. We really appreciate it, man.
Yeah, absolutely. My pleasure.
Congrats, you finished the video. If you want to build on that success, download the NBC Sports Chicago app. It's got highlights, exclusive insights, and push alerts tailored to you. Everything you need to be a real Chicago sports fan. Download it now.